Okay, hello, welcome to Unconscious Thought Theory as a creativity tool. If you're watching this video, hopefully means I'm not dead. It just means you're watching a backup video I made in case there was a internet failure or a power failure in Marrickville in Australia. Alright, so let's dive in. My name is Luke Kendall. I'm writing a series of sci-fi fantasy books about a lovable young assassin. Thanks for choosing to attend this session. And let's dive straight in. So what we'll cover in this workshop is why you should listen to me, how unconscious thought theory can help in writing, what is unconscious thought theory and the science behind it. We'll try a practical exercise, split it into two parts. I'll talk a little bit about how unconscious thought theory worked out for my writing, and we'll also talk then about how other people use unconscious thought, unconsciousness for for the creativity. Also, how it can be helpful for writers to dealing with some kinds of writer's block. We'll go back to complete the practical exercise, and I'll give you a few tips, and that will just end with some further references. So the handout has lots of links in it, but the idea is not to use that during the session, just as reference for you in the future. So why should you bother listening to me? Whoops, a daisy. So I'm not going to claim to be an expert on unconscious thought theory, UTT. I may be one of the few people with the experience in consciously applying it to the writing process. Until maybe after today. Anyway, from 1991 till 2015 I worked for CoNZealand's Australian Research Centre, and around 2014 they paid for a full day workshop for 30 or so people on what UTT was and how it could be used in innovation. In 2014 my wife of 30 years died, and then a few months later I was retrenched. And I decided to throw myself into the writing. In fact, mainly because of a life-changing suggestion from an insightful career counsellor, Karen Tisdall. So I decided to pursue my lifelong dream of becoming an author. Now, I had a 140,000 word manuscript that I'd first completed in 1993 and reworked off and on until around about 2005 when I just set it aside. But then, working on the book, by the middle of 2015, following advice from my editor in Ireland, Dave Taylor, he said I had probably 2 or 3 books crammed into this single manuscript. So I had a big problem. After splitting the book in two, I needed a new plot and a climax for what had been the midpoint. And I found the solution by taking what I'd learned about UTT for innovation and applying it to my creative writing. So, how can it be helpful? Oh, and make sure that you have a piece of paper and a pencil or pen at hand for later on. So in this workshop, I'll share what I know about using your unconscious mind for creative work, specifically by applying the unconscious thought theory. And we'll also try it out with a practical exercise. So here, I've listed some things I've found it useful for: plotting, inventing stuff, restructuring a story, coming up with twists and surprises, solving continuity problems, fitting new elements into an existing story, overcoming some kinds of writer's block, and escaping corners that I'd painted myself into. So what is UTT and what's the science behind it? It's relatively new and mildly controversial theory about the unconscious thought processes, but it is grounded in science. I summarise the theory this way. We have a rational, conscious part of the mind and an unconscious part of the mind, and the two work very differently. The rational mind is more logical, analytical and sequential. The unconscious part is highly parallel and great at finding patterns and making connections. And the third thing is that we can consciously prod our unconscious into tackling problems for us, provided we distract our conscious mind in the right way at the right time. So here's a quote from the German philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer, who wrote, "One might almost believe that half of our thinking takes place unconsciously. I have familiarised myself with the factual data of a theoretical and practical problem. I do not think about it again, yet often, a few days later, the answer to the problem will come into my mind entirely from its own accord. The operation which has produced it, however, remains as much a mystery to me as that of an adding machine. What has occurred is, again, unconscious rumination." So here are a few references. So that first one here is the original paper, and it was followed up by some neural evidence for the process. Now, it began being applied in business contexts to help in things ranging from decision making to innovation, but more recently a study has found evidence that the unconscious doesn't just absorb experience, that the unconscious thought can be a kind of rational, and that matches my own experiences with it since 2015, when I started using it as a tool in my writing armoury, tool chest. So one of the first psychological experiments leading to UTT involved asking people to solve some real life problems, like rating a set of apartments that they were going to buy or live in. So the experiment presented 4 apartments, 1 desirable, 1 undesirable, 2 neutral, and provided information like how big the apartment was, how old, whether it was close to public transport or hospitals, and that sort of thing. 12 aspects across 4 apartments, giving a total of 48 pieces of information to absorb. And then they broke the people up into 3 groups. The first group was asked to work out the best apartment rationally, logically, in 3 minutes. And the second group was decided immediately. And but the third group was distracted for 3 minutes and then asked to quickly decide. And they found that only the third group performed significantly better at choosing the desirable apartment. So another piece of evidence for the unconscious is that functional MRI studies have shown that when your unconscious mind is at work on a problem, up to 50 areas of the brain go active. In contrast, if you're doing a logical task, there tends to be just 1 or 2 parts of the brain active. So the unconscious seems to work in parallel, whereas the conscious mind is serial, and it works on things one step at a time. The unconscious, in contrast, can process, store and link large amounts of information, but the conscious thinking comfortably only remembers about 7 things at the same time. On the other hand, the unconscious is very poor at working out logical stuff. It can't do arithmetic, it doesn't do if then else, chains of reasoning or logic, but it is great at finding patterns and weighing up fuzzy pros and cons. So the key idea of the unconscious thought theory is simply this. Simply stated, people can either think about things or not. And the unconscious thought theory just adds the idea that we can think unconsciously. So with that basic information, and given that this is a workshop, let's try the technique ourselves right now. So grab your pencil and paper, and what I want you to do now is think about some problem you have that needs some creativity to solve. So the first step, I'll run through this quickly and then give you a chance to do it. So the first step is to write down in bullet points what you know about the problem. Now that'll consciously freshen up what you know about the problem, and that information feeds into your unconscious and helps signal that it's something requiring your attention. The second step is to read back over those notes, and if you think of more points while you're doing that, then add them on. And the third step is to think about the problem any way you like, logically or idly, for just a little while. But if you do start finding yourself thinking logically and trying to reason it out, be very wary of that. This is supposed to be the phase where we're just collecting all the pieces of the problem. And the fourth step is to distract your mind. So, I'm going to keep on waffling for a little while you write down the problem in its parts, but don't try to solve it. So please ignore me now. I'll turn down the volume or take your headphones off for 3 minutes, and I'll wave like this when the time's up and you should sort of start listening again. Don't worry you'll miss anything, because I've captured sort of what I'm blathering on about on the next slide, so you won't miss it. But disconnect now. So the time starts now. And I'll keep talking just so there's not dead air in the video. So by writing down the elements of the problem, it consciously freshens up what you know and it feeds it into your unconscious. So you jot down whatever you can about the problem. That includes things like all the conflicting goals you're trying to achieve. I had a tricky plot point where I ended up listing 6 or more things I wanted to achieve all at the same time, and some of them seemed contradictory. Anyway, you write down the things you must have, the things you must avoid, or things you'd like to have or like to avoid. Stuff that might be involved, including people. Other stuff you could write down, note about the problem would be the tone of the solution you're aiming for. You might think of some possibilities or fragments of ideas. You might consider how much time can pass in this scene that you're going to write, or this problem you've got to solve. Minutes, days, or years. When you're writing a story, you should consider perhaps what the resources the characters have available to them. Basically, what you do is you write down anything you feel could be relevant. If you're alone and work in your own time, you might also consider whether you've already made notes of ideas to consider later one day, fragments of things you could return to one day. So in which case you could dig out those old notes and read back through them, or you could do searches for helpful information that could factor in. Anyway, once you've written them all down, you read them again. You might think of extra details to factor in. You might be inspired and find ideas that you feel could be part of the piece of the puzzle. So just write them all down. And once you've got them all piled up and buzzing around in the back of your mind, you can think about them any way you like, just for a little while. But at some point though, if you haven't solved the problem, especially if you feel like you're going in circles, that's the point to stop. So at that point you want to stop the logical part of your mind from trying to calculate the answer and let your unconscious mind get to work on it. By now it knows you want a solution to the problem, but it doesn't hurt to explicitly state that to yourself as well, and even write it down. And then you distract your logical mind for a while so it can't get in the way and try to take control. Alright, so it's time now to come back. So hopefully you've all put your earphones back in or turned my volume up. So what we've just done is the first half of the practical part of the workshop. We're just sort of loading the problem into your unconscious, and it will now start working on that in the background while you listen to me talk about the topic. So I'm not going to claim that you'll definitely have an answer to your problem by the end of this workshop, but you might. It's going to be our little experiment. And I think this is being recorded, so hopefully if at any point you want to mute me or take off your headphones because you've just had a brilliant idea, then go ahead. You can replay that part you missed later, or skim the handout to get the gist of it and catch up. So now continue distracting your conscious mind by telling you how it that was what I waffled on about. So I'll tell you how it worked out for my own writing. So in my first book, the big piece of feedback from my editor handed me a big plotting problem to solve. And after going round and round in circles and getting nowhere, it occurred to me one day to try out the theory I'd learned about for business innovation and see if I could use it for writing. So I did, and a few days later I came up with a solution, and afterwards I thought, holy smoke, that actually worked. So later in the first book I had another smaller plot problem to solve, and I thought, well, it worked the first time, it worked once, I'll try it again. And a little bit later I tweeted that I'd solved what I had, the problem I had, with what I called in the tweet a horrifying teacher idea. So the next time I needed a creative solution, I tried it again, and lo and behold, it worked again. So I kept using it and it kept working. Now what I have discovered is that depending on how tough the problem is, the more time it takes. So you got this problem of how to know whether your unconscious has solved the problem. So what I'd do is I'd check back in to the problem and see how it's going. So I'd get my pencil and paper or whatever I'd taken the notes on, and I'd write down any fresh thoughts I had, more aspects of the problem to consider, or ideas of things that might help that could partly solve it. And if my unconscious had the solution ready, I found that when I started writing, the solution would just emerge, one sentence or thought at a time, and I'd write that down, and then the next and the next, until I had all the pieces that I needed, like I had the solution roughly worked out. At other times though, nothing would come, and I'd realise that it was just not ready yet. I think going back to the problem and just checking in keeps your unconscious mind working on the problem. And when I'm using this, the UTT often feels like I'm working on a mental jigsaw puzzle. Sometimes I'm finding pieces, and sometimes I'm fitting pieces together. Another of the nice things about the unconscious thought theory, using it for your writing, is that it takes some of the self-critical pressure off you. Instead of thinking, I don't have a solution, I'm stuck, you can honestly tell yourself, I'm still working on it, don't rush me, good things take time. So suppose you're writing about a character and they're currently stranded in a desert. If you have negative thoughts like, there's no way she can survive in the desert without water, then you either add that point to the list of things to factor into your problem. My character needs to find a way to survive in the desert. Or if that point's already on your list, just say, yep, it's there. So that'll make a great surprise for the reader when she overcomes that problem. So what about other people? Do others use their unconscious for creativity? You bet. I was listening to a TED talk by Elizabeth Gilbert speaking about the pressures that creative careers place upon you. In the talk she called Your Elusive Creative Genius. She said that the notion that creativity came from within the individual, and so the artist alone deserved both all the joy of success or all the pain of failure, only arose in the last 500 years or so. And before that, people felt the burden of both success and failure was a shared one, like the ancient Romans believed in a genius loci, a spirit that lived literally in the walls of their home, and when propitiated, helped the creator invent, among other things. So Elizabeth also interviewed the great American poet Ruth Stone when she was in her 90s, who spoke of being able to sense when a poem was on its way. To her it was like a thunderous wind barreling towards her across the plains, a great storm. And unless she could get inside a house and get to a pencil and paper, by the time this mighty storm train of a poem crashed through her, she'd lose it. So she'd run for the house. If she got there in time, she could capture the poem and copy it down, but if she was too late, it had surged through her and past and be lost. But if she could grab that pencil before it had passed completely through her, she could kind of reach it out, spear it with a pencil tip, and drag it back inside her body, gripping it until she could find a piece of paper, in which case she would then haul it back inside her, word by word, transcribing it onto the paper. And most fascinating of all, it would be in reverse, word for word, backwards. So I'm basically quoting from Elizabeth, I hope there. She also interviewed the musician Tom Waits, who had similar experiences, until in the middle of life, he did something novel one day, which changed his whole process. She tells how he was driving on the freeway in Los Angeles, unable to stop, and suddenly heard in his head what he called a most delightful melody, and he knew he had to capture it straight away or it would be lost. So all the usual stress and tension started building up. But this time, instead of panicking, he looked up into the sky and said out loud, "Excuse me, do you not see I'm driving? Does it look like I can do anything for you right now? So either you come back later when I can give you the care and attention you need, or go and bother someone else. Go and bother Leonard Cohen." And she told the story of herself of one of the depressing times while working on Eat, Pray, Love, when she became convinced that what she was writing was not just going to be the worst book she'd ever written, but the worst book ever written. And then, remembering what Tom Waits had told her, she leaned back in a chair and said to an empty corner of the room, "Look, you and I both know this isn't all just on me. I'm doing the best I can. I'm putting everything I have into this, but it needs the both of us. So if you're not going to do your part, well, I'm going to sit here and keep working. But I'd like the record to show that I showed up for my part of the job. So Elizabeth's thought was that by putting all the credit for success and failure on the shoulders of a single person, we're putting incredible pressure on each creative individual. And it's this awful pressure that leads to so many well-known stories of writers and other artists literally dying. If not through conscious suicide, often through disabling addictions or disastrous life choices. And she felt that by acknowledging a spiritual dimension to the process, that huge burden can be shared. So I feel that just knowing your unconscious is able to help solve your problems, that helps ease the burden. Now, it's hard to avoid stumbling over evidence that the unconscious mind is routinely used to solve creative problems. There's the famous story of James Watson dreaming of a spiral staircase as part of his and Francis Crick's discovery of the double helix of DNA. Neil Gaiman talks of his compost heap, which he fills with random facts and ideas, from which ideas flower. Even our expression, "I'll sleep on it," is an explicit recognition of the creative problem-solving abilities of our unconscious minds. And if you search the internet for how to come up with ideas or stories, you'll often find suggestions like using something like the I Ching or tarot cards, which may be ways of tapping into a spiritual well of creativity. And I kind of basically agree, except that I see that well as being inside us, and the springs that feed us are everything we experience, and it's coming out of our unconscious. I sometimes use a stirring piece of music to get into the right frame of mind to write a dramatic scene. And functional MRI studies have shown that music is known to activate almost every part of the brain. And that's quite like how the unconscious does, which I found to be an interesting point. So what about using UTT for writer's block? Now, that's a fuzzy sort of term, and it's possibly unhelpful or even damaging, some people claim. Some people say it's not even a thing in itself, it's a symptom, not a cause, and others disagree. But it's not really, that's not important. We all can get blocked. And if you suspect that something is blocking your writing, then you can tackle that as a problem itself. You can put some conscious thought into that. So there's no reason you can't think about why you might be being blocked as a problem, and see if you can work it out unconsciously if it's not obvious. Of course, there are many, many things that can interfere with or stop you from writing. So how to get past the block probably depends on what's causing it. But I'll mention a few that I overcame using UTT. So one thing for me, remembering all the elements for a scene or a story arc, all the characters, the plots, all the bits of plots, the resources, the setting, the tensions in play, all that sort of stuff takes mental effort. And I found simply by writing that stuff down, it removed that burden. On more than one occasion, I couldn't progress because I was mentally juggling all these things, and it was taking so much effort just to remember them all that I had no spare capacity to invent what I needed to move forward. So that's one thing that can block me. And writing it down also primes the unconscious, so it can start looking for patterns, making connections, and extrapolating from what's there. On other occasions, I had my plans for what was going to come next, but somehow I kept finding other things to do first. Sometimes there are real life issues I had to deal with as a priority, but not always. But then more than once, when I chose to stop or had to stop and actually had time to let my mind wander, a great new idea emerged very quickly. So quickly, in fact, that I suspected I'd felt distracted or demotivated because my unconscious had that idea waiting, but I hadn't given it the stillness it needed, the opportunity for the idea to surface consciously. And on a couple of occasions, the new idea saved me from heading down a plot path that would have dead-ended and needed to be thrown away. Now, sometimes, of course, it's a real-life problem that needs to be dealt with. So let's go back to the workshop exercise. I think it's time now. So I want you to go back to the problem you posed yourself, skim through your notes to the end, and over the next 30 seconds, just 30 seconds, start writing something relevant, ideally the solution. It might emerge as you start writing, But don't start trying to reason out the answer, just start writing. So I'd like you all now to silence me for 40 or 50 seconds so I don't distract you as I keep talking, and let's just see how we all do. And I'm going to keep talking to avoid dead air again, but it's captured on the next slide so you won't really miss it. So take the headphones out, the time starts now. So I think the unconscious is often the source of lots of our ideas, but the trick to use it, there's a threefold trick to use it. First, just knowing it exists and that you can use it to solve some kinds of problems. Second, feeding it enough raw materials so there are bits and pieces for it to connect to solve the problem. And the third piece is leaving a silent space for it to present its answer to you. And I've found the more I use it, the more I come to know the feeling when my unconscious has something ready for me or is trying to tell me something. It's by no means obvious. At least for me, it's not like some voice in my head that tells me the answer. Yeah, and like I said, on a couple of occasions, I would have missed major improvements to the book I was writing if I hadn't been alert to ideas that were ready in my unconscious. So I think that's about 40, 50 seconds. So put your earphones back in or turn me up. So how do we all do, I wonder? I'd like to hope that many of you have cracked a knotty problem, or at least now see a path to the solution. But if not, keep applying the technique. Keep checking back in every day or a few days to see if your unconscious has cobbled together the patchwork genius idea you need. Feel free to leave a comment in the chat. Either way, well, you if this is recorded, then you'll get to see each other's chat, but I won't be able to respond to it. But if it's live, then hopefully we can. All right, so let's go on to my tips. Oh, that was just the notes for what I've blathered on about if you muted me while you're doing the exercise, the second part. Oh, what? Oh, I see. I forgot to click on for that first slide. Oops. All right, so here are my tips. There's a list of other things to do to help you use UTT, the unconscious thought theory, in your creative endeavours. They're in no particular order. Write stuff down. That's a key point. Don't rely on your memory. If you don't record the ideas, you'll waste mental energy consciously remembering them or worrying about them. And also, once they're written down, you can reread them, maybe years later if you find yourself in a hole. Clear the decks of clutter. For the intense parts of the creative thinking process, the parts where you make the act of creation your top priority and give yourself time exclusively for that, you need clear mental space. If you have other tricky problems you need to solve, then either deal with them first, set them aside, or you'll just have to accept that it'll take longer because your unconscious will be working on multiple problems at the same time. And sometimes you can clear mental space for a problem just by writing the problem down as a to-do thing for later. Don't allow yourself to get daunted. The funny thing is that although the number of pieces to a problem might look scary, each issue or each part is just another piece of the puzzle. And in a way, I've found it adds to the richness of the solution. It adds to the stuff your unconscious can use to create an arrangement that makes them all fit, or at least makes them blend. Allow yourself time. Set aside distractions as far as you can and give yourself time. And do that as often as you need to in each attempt to come up with the needed idea or ideas. So try and try again. You don't need to solve the problem in a single session. Sometimes the solution will turn out to be a jigsaw that needs to be assembled. Sooner or later, though, you'll probably start sensing the big picture, and then you'll start filling it in quickly. Trust your instincts. Your gut will often tell you this idea feels right, and trust it. Think about the idea and around it, and your gut is basically your unconscious talking to you, so don't ignore it. You might be missing facts. It's possible you're blocked because you're missing some piece of the puzzle. For instance, in one instance, I simply hadn't imagined the physical layout of the part of the scene I was writing, so I stalled each time I tried to actually start writing it down. Now, I've blogged about UTT and creativity several times, probably in far too much detail, but those blog articles might be helpful for anyone who'd like to read more about applying the technique. And I've got a link there to just one example of that, which happened to me while I was writing the fourth book in my series. So we're just about at the end now. So summing up, I suppose, for authors and artists, everything you do, every movie you watch, every poem or piece of music that resonates with you, every person you meet, every pain you suffer or joy you feel, it all goes into that Aladdin's treasure cave of your unconscious, where the alchemy of the most complex thing in the universe, the human brain, goes to work to transmute it into thoughts and ideas and works of creation. So we each carry around inside us a fount of creativity that we can tap into quite easily. It's sensitive to our moods, it's sensitive to and absorbs facts and impressions, sights and sounds and smells from the world around us. It's synthesizing ideas and joining facts together, juggling things and looking for patterns. And best of all, if something is important to us and we consciously pose a problem, that mighty unconscious array of mental powers goes to work trying to solve it. So humans are basically imagination engines, naturally generating ideas like the sun generates light. It's what we do. So thanks for listening to me, and I hope this little workshop will prove useful for you in the future. And I've just got another, on the handout there's some further references in case you wanted to do extra reading. So thank you all for coming along and listening, and that's it. Bye.